Good afternoon. Welcome to Restart Michigan with KPMG Supply Chain Resiliency, How to Better Prepare and Manage Disruptions, Part 2 of the 3-part series. My name is Tabitha Mensch, and I am an engagement manager with the Detroit Regional Chamber and Mish Auto. Thank you for joining this session. The Chamber launched this series of webinars to help businesses across the state prepare to restart operations and return to work. I would like to thank our guest speaker, KPMG, for volunteering their time to share their expertise. Before we get started, I wanted to make all participants aware that you are on mute, but you do have the option to submit questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. Our speakers will try to address as many questions as time will allow. I will now turn the webinar over to Chris Coffin from KPMG.
Hey, thanks, Tabitha. As Tabitha mentioned, my name is Chris Coffin. I'm going to be your moderator for today's discussion. Joining me are Rob Barrett and Kerim Ozbilge. Rob leads KPMG's U.S. supply chain and operations practice and has served clients in the automotive space for over 15 years. Kerim is a managing director also in our supply chain and operations practice. He spent 20 years helping clients in industrial manufacturing, automotive, and heavy equipment industries solve complex supply chain challenges. I'm excited for today's discussion. We've only got a short time with Rob and Kerim today, so why don't we just jump in and get started. This concept of resiliency has been a topic on everyone's mind as of late. Rob, could you start by telling us, what is resilience and why is it becoming more relevant in today's supply chain landscape?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone that's joined us. Hey, before we really get into it, we want to make sure the session is for you. So please do fire away with questions in the chat room. Let's take those live. Let's make it as interactive as we possibly can in this virtual environment. So been thinking about some things that you might have on your mind and share with us, and let's have a discussion about it. So resiliency is one of those interesting things that seems to be incredibly important for short bursts of time every 3 to 5 years in response to an unplanned or seismic event, if you will, in the supply chain. I'm thinking more recently with the current pandemic and the breadth of impacted parties, that resiliency is not going to be a fleeting discussion. It's going to be something that we actually address. And so, let's start with the definitions you said. I mean, resiliency is, in a simple definition, the ability to bounce back, right? So how quickly can you return to not necessarily your previous state, but a acceptable state, and how reliably and predictably can you do that? Right, so when any form of event happens, will you break? Will you bend? And if you bend, will you bounce back in an acceptable state? So, I think that's what we're talking about here. Is most folks were caught a little flat-footed in recent events. Not every supply chain was impacted equally. It really depends on who you are, the markets you serve, and the role you play. But by and large, most were impacted in a negative way. And I think, some folks right now have said, boy, we haven't bounced back to where we were. And we need to think about, resiliency and what we're going to do about it going forward.
Thanks, Rob. I think that makes a lot of sense. Next, I kind of want to talk a little bit about some of the complexity that's out there. So, Rob, what are you seeing in terms of complexity in the supply chain space? Can you talk about some of the main drivers of this complexity and maybe how it relates to the automotive industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just previously stated that not everybody's been impacted the same. I think auto, aero, core conglomerates have been hit especially hard by recent events, and part of the reason that things have impacted auto so much is just the sheer level of complexity. Now, before the recent circumstances, the supply chain was already becoming more complex in auto, right? It's kind of the running joke, is a car wheels with electronics, or is it electronics with wheels? And kind of the convergence of two different supply chains that operate at different clock speeds. And it's fascinating. So there's a high degree of variety in products and the move towards autonomy and the ushering in of, a more diverse electronic vehicle set, all at the same time, trying to meet CAFE standards and other, efficiency requirements. And then you have the variety in channels and routes to market on how you might market and or acquire a vehicle, and just the operational complexity. I mean, typical vehicle launches used to be north of $1 billion, and configuring that supply chain, and many times that resulted in 60% of that supply chain being sole source partners. So you put all that together in kind of a cauldron, and it is an incredibly complex environment. And I'm not even getting to the point of regional requirements and or standards that need to be met, and the notion of manufacturing and supporting diverse needs around the world. So needless to say, auto is one of the most complex supply chains, and therefore probably more challenging than others to build resiliency into.
Thanks, Rob. You brought up some good points there. I want to ask Kerim, given these complexities, Kerim, how are companies responding to these challenges and risks? And secondly, how prepared are organizations to address this disruption?
Yeah, Chris, thanks. So as Rob mentioned, today's global economy, the companies are facing tremendous amount of complexities in their organization, and which then they are dealing, as a result, they are dealing with various risk factors as well as disruptions, right? So these could be financial related risks, reputational risk, operational, regulatory, and geopolitical, whatnot, right? So despite all these increased frequency and magnitude of these risks and disruptions, unfortunately, many companies are not putting enough emphasis to manage their growing global supply chain risks, right? So obviously, each company is different in terms of their supply chain risk management and resilience maturity. If you look at those companies that are on the low side of the maturity, they typically don't have a formal risk management programs. They are fairly reactive, and they approach risks in a very silo fashion across the business functions. They create ad hoc teams to deal with each individual crisis at a time with no business continuity plans and policies. Majority of these organizations, they are kind of like lacking end-to-end visibility of their supply chain. They don't necessarily monitor risk events on a consistent basis, right? And yet many still relying on old technologies and Excel spreadsheets for managing these complex disruptions and risks in terms of managing and simulating various scenarios, right? But on the other side, as we see companies increasing their supply chain risk management maturity, what those companies are doing, we see companies forming a more formal risk management programs at the enterprise level, and that are supported by the top management. They establish global cross-functional teams to manage risk and their day-to-day operations with established business continuity plans, business processes, and procedures. They continuously evaluate the changes happening in their supply chain. They monitor risks real-time, proactively. They run simulations. And as they do that, they're not only doing internally only, they are incorporating their ecosystem partners into these simulations and continuity planning and so forth. So then, as a whole, value chain, they are ready against these risks and disruptions. And then lastly, I want to add is that the digital transformation is something we've been talking for quite some time. But those companies that are more mature, they basically adopt and digitize their capabilities. We see more analytics capabilities for them to better manage their supply chain.
Yeah, thanks, Kerim. I think that makes a lot of sense. So, we've covered some of the challenges to resiliency. Next, I want to ask Rob, what is your perspective on characteristics of resilient supply chains? What does good look like, Rob?
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. So in our analysis, we've looked at companies that have responded better to situations or been more resilient towards situations than others. And they tend to have 6 different characteristics. So I would say if I went into an organization and I saw these 6 things, it would lend me to believe that they're likely to be more resilient than others. And so let's talk about the 6 ingredients that seem to be present in fairly responsive and best resilient organizations we run into. The first would be around having some flexibility in the network itself. So they thought about their supply chain, they thought about alternatives, they looked at kind of geographic location of supply and whether they're overly dependent and or concentrated in a particular region. They understand what their options are for how they might adapt the network under different circumstances. So they've done some work around building some flexibility into the network. Now that's super easy to say on a PowerPoint slide. It's a little more energy required in the real world to make that happen, but folks that understand their network options, and have thought to build some level of flexibility are certainly going to have a leg up. The second is this notion that you need something that's integrated and collaborative. So it's fine if you have good policies, procedures, mitigation, visibility within your organization, but a supply chain by its very nature is a collection of entities working together to deliver on a series of customer requirements and product sets. So you need to have a very tight relationship with your key partners, especially those that are single source or critical components in the process, that they function as if they are a true virtual extension of your team. So one integrated team, yes, separate W-2s and separate separate corporations, but can they function as one virtual entity, truly aligned, top to bottom? That's also a nice PowerPoint concept, a little bit harder to do, but the folks that are, I'm not saying you need to be totally integrated and collaborative with your 10,000 suppliers. It might be there's 100 that are mission critical to what you're trying to do, and so you have this super tight understanding between the organizations. The third is you can't react to stuff you can't see and monitor. So, the folks that have done really well are the ones that are able to anticipate some level of impact or change, and then they have good visibility to that change coming at them or to their upstream partners that they're dependent on to react to that change with them. So those with good visibility and continuous monitoring certainly have a leg up. And then the next piece I'd stress is the cross-functional governance and control, so that there is pretty good alignment and a pretty well-established playbooks within the organization for who's going to do what in the event of a crisis or a situation, and that shouldn't be, and that should be tested, right? So what is the demand planning team going to do? What's IT going to do? What's the role of procurement? What's the role of operations? What's the role of sales and the commercial teams that might be squaring off with impacted customers? That shouldn't be figured out at the moment that matters. That should be something that's pretty well established, and the teams know how they're going to work together in the event of when certain types of events transpire. The third is highly intelligent and predictive. This is seen, this is not pervasive, but some have really good ways to monitor third-party signals that lend themselves to the likelihood of an event. So they do some corollary items, and it might be monitoring geopolitical events. It might be monitoring elections, sentiment, tax law changes, tariffs, or other regulatory things that are happening in different geos. I mean, an event that impacts the supply chain doesn't have to be, a physical event like a monsoon or a volcano. In this case, we're now dealing with the a virus, but there's other day-to-day events around a regulatory change could have a radical impact, on your business. So a way to monitor and help to predict the impact or likelihood of things will give you a leg up, and then some autonomy, right? So, if I looked at the way some folks reacted to the recent crisis, they may have had playbooks in place. They may have known what they were going to do, but then they didn't have the people to execute on those because everything was so manual. So if there's a way to autonomously pull in relevant information to drive decision making and or use autonomy in some way to help act on the decisions or changes you want to make, that can certainly assist with how resilient and responsive you can be. So these are kind of the 6 ingredients in the cake. If you had all 6 and you did it well, you probably are in the upper quadrant in terms of maturity and likely have a resilient or more resilient supply chain. If you don't have these 6, these are kind of this is the secret sauce, if you will. Look at the network, look at your partnerships, monitor and get good visibility across that end to end. Make sure internally you're aligned and have solid playbooks, some element of cognitive or predictive intelligence, and then let's automate where possible so that we aren't hampered by human beings. Chris, does that help?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rob. Great points. Next, I want to talk about this idea that the best ecosystem wins. I think it's pretty interesting, Rob. Especially in the automotive industry, they rely on multiple tiers of supply. So how do companies leverage their supply chain partners to help build out resiliency, Rob?
Yeah, so this is the trick. If the previous chart wasn't daunting enough to say there's 6 key characteristics of building in resiliency, the other added elements is extending those 6 characteristics where appropriate across your ecosystem of partners that you're dependent on to deliver a product or service to the market. And by ecosystem, I mean it can be the folks closest to you, like your distributors or contract manufacturer or a supplier or your dealership network, et cetera. But there's others too. I mean, I'm not going to assume that everyone on the phone here is pure play auto. You have things like gig economy workers, platform-based businesses, a workforce provider, and then you have suppliers that might be 2 or 3 steps removed from you, call it that tier N supplier that you're dependent on. So I think the challenge is treating that extended supply chain as a virtual extension of your own team, and then putting processes, policies, and monitoring across those folks as well, so that you're all and you got to stress test your procedures. So, it's one thing to pull out the playbook when the crisis happens. It's another thing to pull out the playbook periodically with your key partners to rehearse what you're going to do and in what order in the event that something happens. And it's unrealistic to do this across 10,000 partners, but there should be, through your analysis, where you have points of failure or significant dependency, that you can rehearse these things with the key partners that matter. And maybe that's 100 folks, maybe it's 200 folks. I mean, it's not going to be 10,000.
Great response, Rob. A big part of resiliency in my mind involves predictive supply chain management. Kerim, I was wondering, can you talk a bit about the capabilities that companies should look to build when they're trying to, develop predictive supply chain risk solutions?
Yeah, sure. Chris, let me first start describing what a predictive supply chain management technology or solution is. But as you know, what Rob alluded to is there are 6 ingredients of a resilient supply chain, right? And then predictive supply chain management solution really touches on the 2 of the ingredients that Rob mentioned, is highly intelligent and predictiveness, and then the other one is the supply chain visibility and continuous monitoring. So some others also refer to predictive supply chain management as control towers or cognitive decision centers, right? So these are basically a big data analytics platform that can provide companies a digital representation of their supply chain to continuously monitor the health of their supply chain and provide actionable insights and decision support to the business, right? Companies that leverage such solutions They are typically more agile and responsive to the way how they manage their supply chain risks and disruptions. And as a result, business to take more accurate decisions at speed. They also bounce back faster than others, and during the unprecedented events. And as a result, they're able to reduce their losses in terms of whether it's the revenue, costs, and so on, right? So the capability-wise, there are really three distinct capabilities I would say that these solutions contain. One is the big data and visibility layer, then the prediction of the risks, and then the third component is really the digital twinning and analytics aspect of it. The big data and visibility layer is all about the solutions ingesting data and integrating data from companies' internal systems. This could be an ERP solution, manufacturing execution system, or any sensors, IoT devices that companies may have to enable that internal end-to-end visibility. In addition to that, companies can tap into external data sources to get real-time event information. This could be weather patterns, news feed information, disease outbreaks, regulatory information, and so forth, to then augment their internal data with external data to just basically form that digital twin replication of their supply chain, so that they can, proactively track these risks and through various key risk indicators across demand, supply, quality, and transportation, whatnot. And then the predictive element is really then using this data, these data sets that we talked about, they can then conduct real-time predictive analysis to determine the potential risk exposures that they have within their supply chain. They can receive early warnings and through different alerts and dashboards, right? And then the third element is really the analytics element. It's where this is where the decision support comes into place. Using advanced analytics capabilities, then the users can model and simulate cross-functional scenarios across demand supply to evaluate business impact for making trade-off decisions. And this is mainly to avoid and minimize the impact of these risks. And then they can also basically do scenario analysis, business continuity planning, automated fashion, and to determine the best possible action that they should be taking to mitigate risks.
Yeah, thanks, Kerim. Kerim, you brought up big data, which I think is interesting. Rob, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the role that big data will play when companies are building out resiliency?
Yeah, so the term big data is an interesting term. If we just talk about kind of the data we want, I think the data needs to be commensurate with the risks we're trying to monitor and the risks that could impact our supply chain. So, for instance, if on the finance side, we should be using information to monitor the financial health of our business partners. So obviously, if our business partners get into a financially distressed situation, that could potentially impact our ability as supply chain professionals. So there's a way, in that case, you're looking for data to give you some insights that your partner might have a cash flow issue or, something that, on the financial side that might impact you. On the flip side, there's how do I get earlier visibility to potential things? And so that's using third-party signals or unstructured information to anticipate issues. So, we could look at, weather, we could look at geopolitical sentiment, we can look at the likelihood of regulatory change. All those things can impact supply chain. And on top of that, we have all the standard operational issues. Right. So, are my partners able to fully commit to the demand or the demand changes that I'm making? Have shipments left on time? Are they stuck anywhere in transit? What's the projected inventory look like at various locations that I'm dependent on? So when you put all that together, Chris, I think data is the key ingredient. Some of the data you own, most of the data you don't, right? So most of the data that you're gonna be dependent on to manage risk will come from your third-party ecosystem, and also, unstructured from the world in which we live and the markets which we're trying to serve. So that's a little bit of a fluffy answer, but I think there is no shortage of data available in the world. The trick is understanding what data helps me drive the right insight to manage the certain risks that at the end of the day, could have a material impact to how I, manage my supply chain and build resiliency into it. And so that's where, folks like us can help, right? Figure out, well, what matters? How do we sort through the noise to figure out what risks matter, and therefore what information I need to give me early indicator of those risks? And then if a risk transpires, what information do I need to then appropriately take action? Because that's the second side of the coin, is when things happen, what information do I need to inform my decision making from that point forward? So not an easy answer, but I do like our chances now in terms of having earlier identification of potential problems, more information to assist in solving them than, say, a decade ago, and certainly 2 decades ago. So I think data is an asset, but it can also be a little overwhelming at the same time.
For sure. It's good points, Rob. And whenever we're talking about big data initiatives, they've got to be supported by technology, right? So I want to ask Kerim, what technology options are out there for companies to explore when they're developing, predictive supply chain solutions?
Yeah, Chris, before I get into that, I want to piggyback on what Rob kind of mentioned, right? So it's really I want to focus and put some little bit of emphasis on the data, right? So I think any companies that are thinking of embarking the journey of big data, I think one of the things that we are seeing at our clients is that, importance of having that right and strong governance structure in place and management processes around data, and treating the data as their asset, like Rob mentioned. And that's the majority pain points that we are seeing at various clients as part of the journey. The other one is really as they look to enable these capabilities, like many companies now are augmenting their supply chain organizations with, specific data scientists who has operational background. That's an additional capability outside of technology for companies to consider. And then before they embark the journey, is what's also important is, like Rob mentioned, is that they should have a good strategy in place and a strong roadmap, because this is all about the journey, right? And for example, a global OEM, how they started their journey is that basically they looked at all the risks that they are exposed to in a given year. So in a given year, they had about roughly 700 or so supply chain risks and disruptions that they were facing. And whether these are like floods, storm events, strikes, workforce safety, and so forth. And they had a pretty complex supply chain that they were managing, almost like 100,000 parts, 5,000 suppliers in their supply chain. They produce over 10 million vehicles, and then, almost 2 billion components were moving in their supply chain. So what they did is just basically they looked at their supply chain risk exposures, and they prioritized and determined which one of those they want to solve first. They kind of went about creating use cases, and then as a result, they first worked on those use cases, and then as they show value, then they evolve their set of use cases that they are trying to solve for, and then this turned into a journey, right? Coming to your original question on technology, so it really depends on the needs and the strategy that the company has. There are various cloud-based technologies that are out there, and most of them, they address a piece of the puzzle, right? So whether it's a procurement, transportation, or manufacturing-related risk. But if organizations are looking to address their enterprise-level cross-functional risk solutions, what we are seeing is basically clients using big data platforms and coming up with their own custom solutions, and that are more tailored to what they are trying to solve for. And then in addition to that, I think from data perspective, supply chain collaboration solutions, IoT sensors, augmented and virtual reality and blockchain kind of solutions or other type of solutions can augment the organizations and their predictive supply chain management capabilities.
Thanks, Kerim. We've had some good discussion so far, and before we close out, I want to talk a bit about the path forward, so to speak. Kerim, as we think about this path forward, how can organizations build a culture of challenging their supply chains at regular frequencies and not waiting for another disruption like a virus to make that happen?
I mean, historically, Chris, as we all know, supply chain functions has been a very cost-focused functions, and they've been always lean, right? And not many companies have seen their supply chain functions as a strategic part of their operations. But then, last several years, we started seeing a change in this thinking, and companies now started to see supply chain functions as a strategic part of their enterprise. To differentiate themselves in the marketplace, to become more competitive and deliver superior customer service to their customers, right? And so that's pretty much one. And then I feel like the impact of the COVID-19 really demonstrated the importance and the criticality of the supply chain function for the broader enterprise, and how it can be vulnerable for an enterprise if it's not managed properly, right? And companies have already started taking actions to reevaluate their supply chains even now, even in the middle of the pandemic, how their operating model, physical supply chains, and they are already looking, they started taking actions toward the digital transformation of their function, right? So in terms of the change management component, really companies should look to incorporate, continuous improvement as part of their culture, and that should be, in my mind, mandated by the C-suite, right? And businesses and supply chains are not static; they continuously evolve, and as a result, they should continuously evaluate the weak links within their supply chain. Companies should study trends in the marketplace and evaluate where they are standing in terms of competition and peers, continuously benchmarking and continuously setting improvement targets, that should be established. And then these targets should be mandated to the individual's performance, right? And to create that change behavior. And then organizations should leverage their internal data as well and key performance indicators to also use another mechanism to drive change behaviors, right? That's another important thing. And as we work with our clients and they look to initiate supply chain transformation initiatives, the data is one key point that we are using now to convince key stakeholders why they should be changing their existing processes and procedures.
Yeah, those are good points, Kerim. We talk a lot about technology and predictive risk management, but it's important to consider culture and people and stakeholders that you're going to bring on the journey with you.
Yeah, for sure.
Before we open up to questions from the group, Rob, I'd like to get your thoughts. So, as organizations think about the path forward, what should they be looking to do, near, mid, long term to start building resilient supply chains?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris. hey, let's not waste a good crisis. And I don't mean that flippantly. What tends to happen is the organization quickly gets amnesia about what did happen. And I would say, near term, assuming, you're at a state where your employees are safe and the business is stabilized and you're well past the react phase, and now you're thinking about the reopen recovery. Let's take a look at what happened. I mean, yes, this is just one type of event, but it's a good way to kind of test the system. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at how do we react? Did we follow our playbooks? Did we have playbooks? Did we have to lean on other folks? What information did we not have that we wish we had, or that we ended up having to go get? And take stock of what worked well and what didn't work well. Everything from comms to internal alignment to decision making around, how you might have allocated supply and or responded to customer order requests. So I think let's it'd be a shame as a I have a science and engineering background. It'd be a shame not to try to get as much data out of what transpired to inform how we want to operate going forward. So I would say that's, Chris, something that needs to happen near term. And then some of the other activities are a little bit heavier and longer lift, right? So if you don't have visibility today, it's not something you can automatically get tomorrow. That's going to be a journey to how do you establish visibility and what do you want visibility to, right? If you want better predictive intelligence around third-party insights or triggers that might, be harbingers of events ahead, okay, well that too takes a little bit of time to put in place. Putting playbooks and working with your partners on, quote unquote future evacuation plans or how you might react. That's something you get started on and have a process in place for how you're going to stress test those. So I think the near term is, we've all reacted. We've reacted well in most cases and are at a point of stability. And then there's going to be a period of reflection. So I'd encourage folks to take advantage of that before amnesia sets in and we kind of forget what happened and how we reacted and what we wish we would have done different.
Okay. Great discussion, guys. Rob, Kerim, thanks. I want to encourage folks in the audience today to sign up for our final session in our series. We'll be joined by our friends at Blue Yonder, and we're going to be discussing cognitive control towers and how this technology can unlock value in your supply chain. So if you're interested, go ahead and register for that session. It should be pretty good. I think we've got a couple minutes left. I think we can quickly take one question from the audience. Rob, I'll ask you, and Kerim, feel free to chime in. Given the current global economic climate, do you foresee consolidation within the automotive industry?
Well, I think that's a loaded question, and it depends what part is going to consolidate. I can't make questions at kind of the OEM level. I also think it's dependent on time and what this recovery pattern looks like. If we look back to the 08, 09 kind of period, that resulted in a lot of consolidation for us, and bringing especially at the tier 1, in some cases tier 2 level, is merging a lot of businesses and pulling together disparate operations. So I would imagine that is a potential outcome, Chris, at the end of this. But the added complexity is that, there's an electronic supply chain that's more that we're more dependent on than ever before, and that's in many cases the electronic supply chain as a whole is doing incredibly well right now because technology is in one of those surge categories. So in that instance, we might be fighting for capacity with some others that are willing to pay a little bit more than auto might. So sorry, man, I gave you kind of a wishy-washy answer there. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I think there are some general themes around the acceleration of things like economic nationalism and a notion of build where you sell and buy where you make that might change the physical layout of supply chains and change the reliance on long lead time partners that might have an over concentration in a particular geographic area. I think we're going to see that. Not only that's not just an auto thing, that's going to be pervasive across all core manufacturing. And we have a pretty good piece we published recently on Supply Chain New World Order that talks about the redesign of core supply chain for most manufacturing businesses.
Great.
Rob, Chris, if I may add, like one of the goodnesses that I feel like came out of the COVID is just cross-industry collaboration, right? So if you look at the short of supply of PPE products, the ventilators and so forth, created tremendous amount of collaboration across the industry, with automotive manufacturers and medical device manufacturers, right? So some of the medical device manufacturers share their IP with, OEMs, and OEMs, with agility, they ramped up their production, and adopted these bill of materials, like procurement aspect of it to, manufacture these ventilators. So I know the question was more about consolidation within the industry, but I wouldn't be kind of surprised to see that trend, how the automotive companies may now consider using their excess capacity, to provide services to other industries when it comes to manufacturing, right? So,
yeah. What a great example of resiliency on a macro scale, right? Where you see OEMs starting to manufacture things like ventilators and contributing to PPE production. I think that's a pretty good thought.
And then on top of that, the regulatory agencies, supporting that act, right? So I think it's just when hard times are faced, I think everybody's showing that agility. So I think there are good learnings out of this crisis.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I think that's a really good thought to close out this session on. I want to thank everybody who participated today. Rob, Kerim, thank you for joining us as panelists. I'd like to turn it back over to Tabitha at this point.
This is Tabitha Mensch again from the Chamber to wrap up today's discussion. Thank you for the team from KPMG for sharing your time and insights. To all the participants, thank you for sharing your time. You will soon receive an email from me with a link to today's discussion in case you want to review any of the information shared. Please visit our website at detroitchamber.com/COVID-19 for upcoming schedules for Restart Michigan webinars and our teletown halls, as well as more valuable information and data to help your business return to work. Have a great afternoon.